We begin with celebrations in Ukraine. Ukrainian forces today liberated the city of Kherson. Kyiv saying that it is in the final stages now of reclaiming territory that was left by retreating Russian forces. Moscow illegally annexed 4 regions, including the city of Kherson, just 6 weeks ago. The Kremlin still maintaining, however, that the city will remain part of Russia despite the pullout.
Cheering residents of Kherson hoist the Ukrainian flag again in the city's Freedom Square. It's a rare moment in the battle zones of Ukraine. The departure of Russian forces and arrival of Ukrainian soldiers has brought back hope. The troops are returning to a scarred landscape. These are images of Antonivsky Bridge before it was destroyed. It was the only connection across the Dnipro River near Kherson. Russian forces are believed to have blown it up as they pulled back. Russia says more than 30,000 troops retreated across the river to the southeast. From there, Russian forces have resumed attacks against Ukrainian targets. This is a rocket attack on the city of Mykolaiv, 100 kilometers to the north. Long-range missiles destroyed an apartment building, killing at least 6 people. My mother and father are under the rubble, says 16-year-old Roman. He and his grandmother Natalia could only watch as rescuers searched for survivors. It's Roman's mother's birthday today, and it cannot be her last. I believe she is under the rubble and still alive. The Russian withdrawal from Kherson is another glimmer of hope for Ukraine. But the war continues and Russia still lays claim to the region, even after its troops relinquished the only major city they held in the south.
Well, Ukraine's President Zelenskyy today, he praised the Ukrainian people and the country's armed forces.
Today is a historic day. We are returning to the south of our country, returning to Kherson. As of now, our defenders are on the outskirts of the city, and we are starting to enter. But special units are already in the city. The people of Kherson were waiting. They never gave up on Ukraine.
Was Ukrainian President Zelenskyy there. Our correspondent Nick Connolly, he is in Kyiv. He has more on the latest developments in the city of Kherson.
Well, Ukrainian social media is awash with images like you just saw in that report of kind of impromptu celebrations, people coming out with their Ukrainian flags, hugging Ukrainian soldiers, even without the soldiers, putting up those Ukrainian flags on government buildings. As far as we understand from President Zelenskyy, it's only the kind of special forces that are actually in Kherson itself. They've moved forward faster than the rest of the army. The rest of the army is still outside Kherson, still dealing with lots of mines and other booby traps that are preventing big groups of soldiers coming in. And as we believe it, many thousands of Russian troops who didn't get out in time, who were basically left behind by their own bosses, their own generals, and the Russians then blew up those bridges, so they're now stuck there.
So they're stuck there. What does that mean then for the Ukrainian forces coming in? Are they being told to expect Russian forces that are going to be hostile?
Well, that was the expectation going in. Even yesterday, people weren't really celebrating this announcement. They were very, very suspicious that this was some kind of trap. But it's basically been proven that the Russian military leadership wasn't able to organize any kind of major surprise for the Ukrainians. Instead, it's turned into a fiasco for them. And we've seen Russian soldiers apparently throwing away their uniforms, changing into civilian clothes, hoping to kind of hide away, or offering themselves up to be taken prisoners. So that doesn't seem to be the immediate danger. But you've obviously got those Russian troops on the other bank of the river with artillery in range of Kherson and very much capable of turning that city to ruins.
DW's Nick Connolly joining us tonight from Kyiv. Nick, as always, thank you. Earlier, I spoke to Mike Martin. He's a former British Army officer. He's now with the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And I asked him where this war is heading now.
I think rather than describe it as a turning point, this is another milestone. So we had the pullout from Kyiv in April. We had the operations in Kharkiv, where the Ukrainians took a huge swathe of territory back from the Russians. This is the third major failure of the Russian forces or major gain for the Ukrainians. And it really, since May, the Ukrainians have been taking territory off the Russians. So, and they will continue to do so, it appears.
And Mike, remind our viewers, why is Kherson, why is it so strategically important?
So Kherson was, I should say, the only regional capital that was under the control of the Russians. Your viewers may remember that it was one of the 4 regions that was annexed by Putin, so brought, is legally, according to the Russians, is part of Russia. And it was taken in the first 2 days of the war, and it's the only city that's on the west bank of the river Dnipro. And this river runs from Crimea all the way up to Kyiv, and it splits Ukraine in 2. And so it was the only foothold that the Russians had on the western side of that river, and they've now had to abandon that foothold.
From the outside, for people who may not have been following events in this war closely, I mean, it seems that Russia lost control of Kherson very, very quickly. Is that the case? And are you surprised by the speed of events?
So in one sense, this has been a long time coming. The Ukrainians announced in August that they would be starting operations on Kherson in September. And here we are 2 months later, they've taken control of it. So in that sense, it hasn't taken very long. But what has happened over the last few days, since the Russians announced the pullout, they've then had to conduct a retreat under fire. And that's probably the most difficult type of, in a technical sense, the most difficult type of military maneuver that you have to carry out. And the Russians haven't been very good, and they've messed it up. And we've heard from your package, there are pockets of Russian soldiers are left, equipment's left. So it hasn't gone very well.
So what's the strategy now for the Russian military moving forward? They've pulled back. What options do they have now?
I think what they're trying to do is set the front line for winter. So they've pulled back. They've built more defensive lines and positioned artillery on the other bank that they've withdrawn to. And they've also, in other parts of the country along their front lines, they've dug defences and anti-tank ditches. I think the Russians are trying to dig in for winter, hoping that they can regroup, retrain, maybe bring some of these mobilised soldiers into play.
About 4 weeks ago, we heard Russian President Putin say that Kherson would be a part of Russia forever. Earlier this week, he was not the one making the announcement that Russian troops were withdrawing from Kherson. What message is being sent here? And I'm thinking specifically about what this means for the morale of Russian troops.
I think the morale of Russian troops has been pretty poor throughout the war. Particularly the mobilised soldiers who were given no training, maybe 1 or 2 days and sent to the front line. That's always been very poor. I think, actually, this is classic stuff, isn't it? When there's successes to be announced, Putin announces it, and when there's failures, he gets other people to announce them, the military in this case, because that enables him later on to play the blame game and say, well, they ordered the retreat. It's not holding together very well, unfortunately, for the Russians.
Mike Martin, as always, we appreciate your time and your analysis. It's been a very eventful week. Thank you.
It has. Thank you.
Well, my next guest is one of the world's leading urban warfare experts, Major John Spencer. He is chair of urban warfare studies with the Madison Policy Forum. He's also author of Understanding Urban Warfare. It's good to have you with us. Now that Kherson is in the hands of the Ukrainian army, could this be a turning point in this war?
Absolutely. I think it's another major turning point, and there's been a few, but a symbolic, strategic, and an important victory for Ukraine today.
And remind us, for our viewers, why is Kherson so strategically important?
So sure. I mean, like the broadcast said, it's the only regional capital city that Russia was able to occupy, and occupied this one early in the war. But despite knowing for months and weeks leading up to this that it was falling, And despite rushing their best troops they had left to the Kherson region so that it wouldn't fall, they still lost it. So I think that's a very significant message to what the capability of the Russian military in Ukraine is, given the Western supplies to keep flowing to Ukraine. War is about a battle of wills. Ukraine is not going to run out of the will to fight. Russia is.
Have you been surprised by how quickly it seemed that Russia lost control of Kherson?
No, not surprised at all. We've been watching, as an urban warfare specialist, the battle very closely as Ukraine isolated the troops on the western side of the Dnieper, a major obstacle for a long time, cutting them off from resupply, hitting ammunition depots with long-range fires. I'm surprised that the Russians left themselves this exposed for this long. And I don't believe that they successfully withdrew 30,000 while they're gone. I don't think that many were left. They lost a lot of soldiers in this withdrawal, and they again abandoned more equipment. So they're holding strong to their position as the #1 supplier of weapons to Ukraine.
Our correspondent in Ukraine told me this evening that there are reports that there may be maybe as many as 10,000 Russian soldiers who were left behind. And let me ask you then, what should Ukrainian soldiers, what should they be expecting? I mean, should they be prepared to find hostile Russian forces there, or are they going to find hungry and cold men?
Yeah, so I think you're going to find a combination of it all. Ukrainians have to move forward, and they've already put this out in messaging today, that they're going to approach it very cautiously because of reports of Russian soldiers donning civilian equipment and staying behind. Or, of course, we've seen what happens to Russian-occupied areas, booby trapping, kids' toys, all the horrors. So while this is a great day and it will be celebrated by Ukraine, they're moving forward very cautiously. But I think they're going to find a little bit of everything, to include more surrendering of Russian soldiers.
Well, when you look at this, can you find a strategy then that the Russian military is following, or what can you imagine the next step is going to be? I mean, do they have options now that they have withdrawn?
So it's a very interesting on what they might do. Their strategy is a strategy of desperation. I mean, honestly, that once you lose the momentum in war, many of the strategy here was to hold what they could and hope for a slowing down of the war in the winter, and then maybe somehow try to offer a position of negotiation. But they've never been able to reestablish their lines. They're that low on quality troops and supplies. Mm-hmm. They're turning to North Korea, they're turning to Iran. They're forcing soldiers with no training into the fight. I mean, where would they try to hold now? Is it Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv? Who knows? But I think it should send a signal to everybody around the world, is they're desperate, and the Ukrainians are winning.
If this were to become a war where we see more urban fighting, what kind of condition are Russian troops in? I mean, because, we've heard that, tens of thousands of reservists have been called up and that they're being trained right now. Is it realistic, though, to think that Russia has the capability and capacity to train them to be effective urban warriors, if you will? Because we know that the Ukrainian military has been planning for that eventuality.
Oh, not at all. Especially though, they did this in like waves. Of course, they captured as many Russian citizens as possible and rushed them to areas in the east and in the south with no training. But then they did send some to what was left of their training base. But they're really desperate even there, because they sent many of their trainers into Russia. But Russia has never been on my radar as a proficient urban warfare force. That takes a lot of training, a lot of discipline, cohesive, well-led formations. The Russians like to fight in mass, using artillery in front of them, the way they've organized themselves. I mean, they're still dangerous. I'm not trying to send a picture that there's nothing left of them. mass does have a quality, and that's what they're hoping for. And reports of over 100,000 dead, probably 300,000 wounded, is when will they have had enough?
About 4 weeks ago, the Russian president said in public that the city of Kherson, that region, would be a part of Russia forever. That was just 4 weeks ago. And this week, we saw the new commander of the Russian operation in Ukraine. He went on state television. He was the one who announced that Russian troops are withdrawing. We noticed that Vladimir Putin is nowhere to be found when news of a defeat or a setback has to be announced. What does this do to the morale of his soldiers?
100%. It lowers it, although I don't know how much lower it could go. You need, even in small victories, you need cohesion within your group. You need messages from your leadership to keep morale high, and especially with winter coming. But this is a significant blow to the Russian forces, especially in the south, who are in this areas. Morale, motivation, willingness to fight for Putin. 100% agree. The Russian military has had a revolving door of commanders, and I personally don't think this new one who just got in a few weeks ago will last much longer.
Major John Spencer, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.